Hello and welcome to the Play Review with me, Douglas Schatz.
And me, Jodi Rylett.
Hi, Jodi.
Hi, Douglas.
So today we're reviewing a classic, the new production of Pygmalion at the Old Vic, which we saw together last week. Pygmalion is arguably George Bernard Shaw's most famous play, partly, of course, because it spawned the even more famous film, My Fair Lady. So many will be familiar with the story of the flower girl Eliza Doolittle, who the phonetics professor Henry Higgins teaches to replace her spirited Cockney speech and character with the received pronunciation and deportment worthy of the English drawing room, all for the sake of a bet with his friend Colonel Pickering. The play offers two iconic parts in Eliza and Higgins, played famously in the film by Audrey Hepburn and Rex Harrison. The Old Vic production boasts two of the most respected stage actors of our time in Patsy Ferran, fresh from her Olivier-winning run as Blanche in A Streetcar Named Desire, and Bertie Carvel, who has conjured the figures of Donald Trump and Rupert Murdoch, no less, not to mention Miss Trunchbull in Matilda the Musical. So, Jodi, I assume that you've seen My Fair Lady at some point, but have you seen the Shaw play in the theater before? And if so, or if not, was this show what you expected?
I have not seen the play. I have seen the musical so many times that what did surprise me about the play is how much of it was faithful, as in faithfully lifted straight into the musical version, into the film version. So I've seen the musical My Fair Lady, so it was interesting to go and see it as a straight play. I guess the only thing I didn't expect was that it would be so much the same, that it hadn't been so changed, except for the relationship, the whiff of a romantic yearning in the relationship between Eliza and Henry Higgins, which I think Shaw hated that had been implied in the musical. So I liked that it wasn't.
Yes, the reason this production looks so much like the musical or the film is that, in fact, it was originally written in 1913, premiered in 1914, but Shaw rewrote some of it for the screenplay for his 1938 film version, Pygmalion, which precedes My Fair Lady, which included some of the things that we now see on stage. So what we see on stage is an amalgam of the original and later versions.
Okay.
What did you think of the staging of the show? I mean, the show is directed by Richard Jones and designed by Stuart Lang, both of whose credits include lots of work in opera and musicals. And I think that shows in the design of this show. How would you describe the style of the set and costumes they created here? And does it work for you?
Well, I'd say it worked in some parts and not in others. It was a very stylized set in a way, quite minimal, almost geometric in its shapes. There were the opening Covent Garden scene. It's some very austere columns and a suggestion of a triangle above them to imply the top of the building that is Covent Garden Market. And it was very limited. It was very austere. And all of the energy and colour in the production came from the big performances, particularly of the two central roles. So I didn't mind it at all in Covent Garden. What it did in that opening scene for me is it showed me this isn't going to be a retread of a film you once saw.
Yes.
I don't think it's going to be some kind of hyper-realistic evocation of London at this time. And that was the thing that I found a little confusing in the set and the design, is I wasn't sure quite what time it was referring to. I mean, I think from reading stuff about this production, it was meant to be sort of late 1930s.
Yeah.
And it maybe did have a sense of that kind of I know it had a bit of an Eastern Bloc feel about it sometimes, sort of, East Berlin, which would have been post-war. But that's why I had a bit of a clash. And I wasn't sure with the costume. Eliza's opening costume is almost contemporary. She has like a puffer jacket on that's belted and almost trainers, but not quite. Yeah, so some of the design worked for me and some of it didn't. I mean, what about you?
Well, you're right. I think it is intended to be set in the 1930s, and it had some of the air of the decadence of that time, I think, particularly in the scene that opens the second half, where they reproduce to some degree the ball to which Eliza is invited and has to demonstrate that she'll pass the test. And they have these women in look like 30s dresses cavorting across the stage. And you had some sense of the decadence of this society that might actually be wiped out by the forthcoming war, of course. But I agree with you about the start. I mean, the building in the background, I think they were trying to represent the Inigo Jones Church, the facade of the church there at the market. And that was pretty impressive on the stage, but it was austere and it was very hard to feel close to those characters, I thought, in that kind of monumental setting. Then the rest of it, so large portions of it that are set in Henry Higgins' house, the room is fitted to look like a sound laboratory with speakers on the walls and a wooden finish to the wall that looks very utilitarian, like you're inside some kind of sound studio. And of course, that's to suggest, his professional vocation and that Eliza is in fact nothing more than a vocational experiment of his. But I felt that didn't really work for the domestic scenes that then had to take place within that setting.
That's true. Yeah, it didn't work so well for those scenes, you're right. But I did like it for the others. I like this laboratory style rather than the kind of stuffy library that's usually suggested.
True, and it wasn't doing period in that sense. And in fact, that's continued, and there's the scene where Eliza gate crashes Henry's mother's tea party, undertaking her first test in polite society, where again, I thought it just misses some of the elegance of that setting into which she would have to walk and perform, because they were using, as I remember, possibly the same utilitarian sort of steel chairs that are in Higgins's house. I may be wrong in that, but it just felt a little bit utilitarian. And it was slightly strange setup initially because it starts with a semicircle of these chairs facing upstage with the cast backs to the audience. Fortunately, they did turn around for the scene.
Yeah, they did turn around. I don't know why they did that, but again, I quite liked the way that they did that, because what it did for me was it focused my attention on the lavishness of the spread that was on that table. And in an earlier scene, there's a very entertaining moment when Higgins presents the chocolates to Eliza by way of tempting her to stay and take part in this experiment. And her longing for these chocolates is beautifully physically rendered as she's leaning Charlie Chaplin style over to smell and taste these chocolates. So there's this sharp contrast between an Eliza who was desperate for the taste of a single chocolate and this massive, lavish flower-strewn table with all the gorgeous treats. And it also made it seem like Mrs. Higgins is the hostess, and this is her salon, and she's inviting people into it. I loved that scene when Eliza arrives in her gorgeous sunflower floral dress. The whole thing is just a joy to watch.
It's a wonderfully conceived scene because what you have is her undertaking her first test and she's not quite ready. The advantage of the setup on stage was that the semicircle of guests to this tea party are all facing us in the audience, including her in the middle. And so all we do is observe the nuances of her behavior and on her face in particular, and the way she's saying things. And she delivered this with a wonderful mixture of the old and the new in her character and her behavior, right? So there are elements of the new thing she's being taught, but too much of the residue of what she also is or was. And it's great fun to watch. In fact, what about the performances from the two leads, Patsy Ferran and Bertie Carvel? What did you make of them?
I loved both of them. Patsy Ferran has this amazing physicality about her. I said Charlie Chaplin earlier. That must be an influence because she has a very comic way of moving. And, that won't have been to everybody's taste. To me, I thought it really brought to life this vital energy that this Eliza had. You can imagine her being a real central character in that Covent Garden flower market, that everybody would know Eliza, cheeky Eliza. No one will pull a fast one on her, that she would have this vast confidence in that space. And I thought she embodied that beautifully. And her transition, her demeanor when lost at the end around who am I, what will I be, was beautifully clearly told. And as for Bertie Carvel as Henry Higgins, I did occasionally see shades of the Trunchbull, to be fair. But again, I didn't mind it. I liked the way he played it. To me, he was almost like an irrepressibly naughty schoolboy whose arrested development is now played out in front of us. At one stage, when he goes to tell his mother about her, he's sat on the chair like a little boy, almost desperate with excitement, as if to tell his mum he's found a bird's nest in the garden or something. So I quite liked that. He had this quite high-pitched tone of voice. It worked for me. Again, it won't have been to everybody's taste, but I really liked that. It's hard to shake off the shadow of Rex Harrison and Audrey Hepburn. And I think that they had to do something spectacularly different to be able to do that. And for me, they did. I stopped drawing comparisons quite early on and was just rapt watching them.
Yeah, they did their own thing, definitely. And they are both very fine actors, and it's a joy to watch them at all times that they're on the stage, to be honest. And you're right. I think Patsy Ferran has this fantastic physicality. She exuded this undisciplined energy you spoke about and charm with this fantastically restless physicality initially, particularly. And I enjoyed the fact she didn't overdo the Dick Van Dyke Cockney accent.
Oh, thank goodness. It wasn't "Call lovers up the apples and pears." She'd worked very hard on that, you can tell.
And she also, as you said, she had a very affecting, quiet, steely dignity in her response to the experience of going through this experiment and of facing her uncertain prospects afterwards. And Bertie Carvel, he's the most protean of actors because, as I mentioned, when he portrayed Donald Trump and Rupert Murdoch, his impersonations are just astounding. And here he does create another extraordinary character, I think. He's an out-and-out eccentric, isn't he?
Yeah.
With a very distinctive posture. And you mentioned his voice. It's wonderfully fruity and pitch, but also mesmerizingly precise, of course, as it should be, given his profession. And there's this solo scene in which he lectures the audience, reproducing the defining sounds of each accented vowel. And his vocal control is just extraordinary. Arguably, the scene, I think, spins on a bit too long, but he milks it for all it's worth. And it's a tour de force. What about the secondary parts? Anybody stand out for you?
Yes. Who played Eliza's dad?
John Marquez.
John Marquez. I really liked that performance. At first I was like, oh, what's he doing with that accent? He's meant to have a hint of Wales via the streets of London, and he did that very well. I loved, again, you could see where Eliza gets her energy from and her physicality. He was confidently jumping up on chaise longues and holding the fort. I mean, it's a gem of a part. He gets some great lines. His philosophizing is just spectacular. So I thought he was superb. And Sylvestra Lettusa is Mrs. Higgins. She was super. I loved that she was so very disparaging of the men, that the women in the cast, her and Mrs. Pierce, Penny Layden, they get the very clear view of these silly boys playing with their toys. They see straight through. They see the danger of it immediately. Of course, that's in the writing, because Shaw is, how can he be writing so before his time, that he sees the power that men have and that women don't have. And I thought that came through very clearly. Did you know Sylvestra Lettusa was in that very famous Heineken advert? It's a Pygmalion parody.
Okay, this is news to me.
Oh my goodness, I have to send it to you on YouTube. It's the School of Street Credibility. And she sat there saying, the water in Mallorca doesn't taste quite like what it ought to. And the Henry Higgins type character is saying, no, it's the water in Mallorca don't taste like what it ought to. And then she drinks her Heineken and suddenly she's speaking the language of the street. So how genius that they cast her in this play.
Well, there's a backstory I wasn't aware of.
That's so clever. I thought she had just a gorgeous, commanding charm. Her disdain of her son and taking Eliza under her wing, I thought that was spectacular.
It's a lovely part, isn't it? Because
it's a great part.
Because as his mother, she has Henry's number. She's able to puncture his pomposity, and he becomes the scolded child. And she has a calm, common sense worldview, as well as a reassuring empathy for Eliza. Yes, as you say, Shaw's perception of the female characters is remarkable for his time. And you're right, John Marquez. Alfred Doolittle is a showboating part, the cheeky, chappy father, and he grabs it with both hands, and it's great fun, I think. Michael Gould was Colonel Pickering. who I guess did a fine job in what I always think is a thankless part, frankly.
It really is. It's nothing, isn't it? It doesn't have much to do at all.
He's the dull and sensible Watson to Higgins's flamboyant Holmes.
That's right. It's true.
And it's very boring to be that, I would have thought. There's another one I would mention is Tahin Modak.
Oh, Freddie Eynsford Hill.
Yeah, well, he gets lots of laughs as Eliza's hapless suitor, Freddie.
Yeah.
But I'm afraid that I found his vacuous grin and the conceit of his popping up repeatedly with a bunch of flowers in ever hopeful pursuit of Eliza as a bit idiotic, actually. It just seemed a bit inane and simple-minded, and it meant that for me, the idea of Eliza potentially marrying him would be ludicrous. She was far too smart for that character as it was portrayed.
Well, she was, but I mean, I think that's the genius of it in a way, because that was the lot, right?
Yes.
What else was she going to do?
I know, but I think in theatrical terms, it was overplayed.
It was overdone. Yeah.
I don't know how many times he pops up with the same joke.
Yeah, I agree. It's a shame that he didn't have more to do from a dialogue perspective in actually moving forward the story.
As much as I admire Patsy Ferran and Bertie Carvel and their performances, and they're hugely watchable, I did feel that they're sort of overshadowed by the design of the production. The production seems intent on making its design statements at the expense of the genuine characterization and personal story to some degree. It was only towards the end when they end up with their debate about their personal futures, and the staging becomes very simple, giving us Shaw's words, which are to the point about their respective positions and where Eliza goes from here, and also touching on their mutual feelings, whatever they may be. And I think you said this to me on the night. The moment when he starts to understand the complexities of Eliza's response and what her future might be, and that she might not stay, and his life might not continue in the same comfortable way, you can see him both bewildered, but also the sadness in him.
Yes.
Which I thought he did very well. But again, it's because the production slowed down to me a bit and became a little bit more genuine.
Right. And I think that's it, slowed down. For me, it wasn't so much about the design that took away from that relationship. It was the pacing, because as much as I enjoyed the fact, I think I said to you at the end of the first half, that, oh, that whipped along. I mean, it really did whip along. Any sort of struggle that they might have had with Eliza learning this new way of speaking wasn't really played out that much. Yes, you could see that they were working hard, both of them, but at no point did it seem like it was never going to happen. There was no jeopardy. It just went very, very quickly. Oh, yes, she gets it. She's a natural learner. But because you don't get any of the tension that you get between a teacher and a student when the student doesn't get it and the student wants to get it and the student's capable of getting it, but they're tired, none of that came through.
That was also true in the big scene that we talked about at the beginning of the second half, where she goes to the party and is supposed to demonstrate that she's able to operate in that level of society. And the way they staged that, there were just people constantly moving off and on the stage, including the main characters, just to create the hubbub of this party and the scale of this party. But to me, they lost then the focus that you want on her and her performance. How well is she doing in every moment of her performance? That's what we should be watching. They never let it settle to be able to observe that.
Yeah, that wasn't successful, that opening scene for me either. But yeah, you're right. The pacing, when it slowed at the end there, at one point, as good as that was, and I was hanging on every word, I did also feel, crikey, this is going on a bit, because by comparison to the way it had been paced, my level setting was at a faster pace.
So here's a question. It's easy to think of Shaw as quite dated now. It's written over 100 years ago. What did you make of the themes that he raises and the subject of this play? How do you think it survives?
I think it absolutely survives. I don't understand why more of a fuss isn't made of Shaw, why his work isn't staged more often, because I touched on his representation of women and his understanding of their relative powers in society. He had this sense of social mobility. I mean, you can't open a newspaper, you can't look on a news site without talking about social mobility. It's still real. We still haven't cracked this. And this whole piece around accent bias, I'd love to think that it was a thing of the past. As somebody who grew up in the Northeast and moved to London, and I deliberately no longer speak the way that I did when I grew up. And in a way, I wish that I could whisper into the ear of my 24-year-old self and say, ignore them, Jodes, just speak how you speak. It's part of who you are. But frankly, the Sutton Trust have done a report called Accents and Social Mobility in November of 2022. And tragically, their key finding was there is still a hierarchy of accent prestige entrenched in British society. 35% of university students are self-conscious about their accent. 29% of students from the north of England are concerned their accent is going to affect their ability to succeed. Employees reported being mocked or singled out for their accent in a social setting, 46% of them. I mean, so this play is not a play about some posh bloke back in the olden days. It's saying very real things about how we make judgments and how we box people based on all kinds of things, and accent is one of them. And interestingly, when it comes to diversity and inclusion and the law around that, it's not a protected characteristic in any way, but it's proven. They have recent research that shows interviewers will more favourably look upon candidates who speak in quote unquote standard English as opposed to those who don't.
This is fascinating, Jodi. Thank you so much for all that, because, yeah, you've proved the point. It remains astoundingly, disturbingly relevant that people are still judged by class, which may be suggested by their accent, and that can somehow inhibit their professional prospects.
Yeah, I mean, the root to me, of course, was education, not accent. And that's the proxy, really, in this play, isn't it? He's educating her, not just in how to speak, but also how to be and how to navigate society and learning. I mean, she goes on in the epilogue of the play to pass on his tricks to other students and makes money from it. So education is the way out. But it's so interesting that post-education, coming to London, it was definitely something that I was frequently mocked for, and I could take it, but it wasn't nice. There was this brilliant piece, Alex Scott, the footballer, 140 appearances for the England women's team, etc. And do you remember in the news during the Olympics, there was a spat because some lord tweeted something like, I can't stand it anymore. She spoils her good presentation job with not being able to pronounce her G's. They're not taking part in fencing, boxing, rowing, kayaking, weightlifting and swimming. Can't someone give these people elocution lessons?
Oh my God.
So it hasn't gone away. Shaw is still relevant. I would love to see more of his stuff.
I think we are agreed that it's a good thing that Pygmalion is still put on. I would say that the didacticism, which Shaw actually confessed to, is actually pretty light-handed. It's contained in the sweet wrapper of an almost romance and lovable characters, certainly, and a great story. And you talked about the almost romance. I enjoyed the fact that they did not overplay that between the leads, as Shaw himself counseled against.
Yeah, me too.
We would recommend seeing Pygmalion, would we not?
We would recommend seeing it and enjoy watching that scene at the end and the symmetry of it. She is dressed in a silk brown trouser suit that reflects his, to imply a degree of maybe some equality is coming here. Certainly a greater equality in status as their mutual respect for one another shows up. So I'd say it's definitely worth a ticket. Go see it. I'd love to know what other people think about it.
Yeah, it's great. An equality she has earned. So Pygmalion continues at the Old Vic Theatre until the 28th of October. And if you'd like to delve deeper into Shaw's play Pygmalion, tune in to our episode of the Play Podcast coming shortly, during which I will talk in depth with Shavian expert Ivan Wise. Thanks for listening to another play review. Thank you, Jodi. See you next time.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
We'd love to hear what you think, so please visit theplaypodcast.com to share your comments, or email us at plays@theplaypodcast.com. Thanks for listening. See you next time.